Right, perhaps first things first. Just to say something about what prompted my kind of want to sort of undergo a postgrad research. I think it's frustration, really, because I've always been a practicing painter, artist and a painter. And after about 15 years in the studio, all kind of became a little bit too repetitive. And suffice to say, I almost fell into a hole of my own making, if you like, because the actual idea of creating almost a stylized approach, a language, became somewhat insufficient within a studio confound. Now, I've always had a really sort of a deep interest, not necessarily in writing, but a philosophical inquiry into painting. Bluntly put, I always thought painting for me is about philosophy, about a thought. And I thought, how can I possibly devise a sort of operable kind of theory, methodology that can accommodate that thought? And what is it exactly that I meant by that? So when I first actually started with the idea of a research, I had a very sort of superficial approach that was premised on a sentence in a cinema book by Deleuze that was referring to a shock to thought. And he niggled at me for years what that could have and what that meant. And when I actually proposed to do the PhD research at first, I assumed I had a kind of very much an idea as to what that meant. And I'm so glad that that idea fell away right at the very beginning. I also very, very early decided not to write about my own work. I guess there was a sort of sense of fear, to some respect, that I would lose the freedom to experiment, which is a paramount to my practice. And I also felt that I didn't want to lose a visual vocabulary that I worked so hard for. So in some ways I kind of felt that, not wanting to play it too safe, I wanted to kind of chart the problems that were happening in the studio that I not necessarily couldn't find a solution to, because there is never just a solution. I just wanted to keep the practice as dynamic as possible, but at the same time be able to kind of look deeper into theory as something that inspires the research, something very akin to what Sadie was saying. So in some ways my idea, a question of what is it that I was kind of researching, was never just about one thing. Looking at it now from a hindsight, I guess the best way of seeing it would be from a point of practice. So I guess I could maybe say my research was about developing a thought within a painting that was actually not just in the painting itself, but in the surrounding space of the painting, i.e. in the studio. Something about a methodology, perhaps, is that when I first began, I was in the middle of the work that I wasn't very happy with. And that work almost created an entrance to the first chapter of my PhD thesis. And as soon as the chapter was kind of written, I decided perhaps that there's a methodology somewhere in there. Instead of actually thinking through singular pieces of work or singular kind of theories I could kind of cover within the thesis, I may look through bodies of work that will actually chart as part of the chapters within the research and the thesis. So I produced 3 chapters and 3 bodies of work. The 3 books here published as well come along. So what I will do at this point is just give it to you, kind of sort of casually have a look at, and if you want to just pass it around. The first one was called Motion and Thought, Mediated Image, and the third one was called Communities. Just going back to motion and thought a little bit, as I said, it was a chapter, it was a kind of almost a period where I was trying to really define what is it that I assumed a shock to thought from a Deleuzian point of view could potentially mean. And he was referring to movement, he was referring to motion. And I actually sort of developed almost a type of work that was chronologizing that motion, that was chronologizing that movement. And halfway through research, I've actually realized that that was exactly what I didn't want to do. I did not want to actually find a way through theories of motion that were actually automated. Deleuze actually suggests exactly that within the sort of notion of a shock to thought, that, you know, that kind of movement, if you like it, that kind of thinking process, if you like, is very much an automated process that's instantaneous through kind of filming, through cinematic instances. I.e., almost as if the narrative is kind of coherently put together, giving us almost a kind of sense, or giving us almost a right to think. I was creating stills within my work in order to be able to make that movement. And funnily enough, it was a very interesting point that Deleuze is talking about Bacon and the idea of Francis Bacon and the idea of a contour that almost kind of returns the sort of whole rhetoric and the whole dynamic of the theory back to the figure-ground relationship I was kind of hoping to dismantle. And at that time I came across a painter called Charlene von Hale. And one of the reasons I actually turned to Charlene von Hale, it was actually because the sense and the notion of movement and the sense and the notion of a thought that was perhaps being able to be traced within that movement was not necessarily stylized and chronologically ordered, but was stylistically non-existent almost, if you like. It was fragmented. One of the reasons I'm saying that is that her approach to practice, which was very, very influential to my work, was very much that of a person that doesn't necessarily just rely on one singular representation within a painting, but very much kind of takes on board the idea of the whole studio practice. And in her own words, whatever surrounds the studio, whatever sort of surrounds the kind of the grounds on which the references and the grounds on which the work is made, that includes materiality, that includes the kind of almost like pictures we put around the studio, actually does influence the way that we talk about the work. But more than anything else, what was really intriguing to me is that she's, as opposed to that sort of idea of automated motion that would somewhat suggest a lack of body, because in a cinematic image, the body is always somewhat removed. What we're left with is the mediator's kind of action, if you like, the subsequent of the motion, the subsequent of the body. What I found in von Hale is that there was exactly the opposite. The idea of the body, the performality of the body, the physicality of the body was very much still present in the work. It was not only present, it was utilized in such sense that, you know, some paintings may necessarily be quite abstract or may be quite conceptual and very minimal in the way they're produced. Others will be completely and utterly kind of, if you like, expressive, you know, referring to abstract expressionism, referring to the, you know, sort of the kind of modernist strategies of image creation. So as I said, you know, a lot of the first chapter really goes into detail as to how that kind of trajectory between a motion perhaps that is seen automatically comes out of itself, comes back into the physical world, doesn't actually become about the virtual any longer, but actually becomes the physical, and it becomes about the practice. And, you know, I have to say along the line, Foucault was really instrumental because, you know, kind of that sort of approach, the kind of discursive and kind of practical, i.e. very physical approach to motion that he kind of talks about in the archaeology of knowledge and in discipline and punishment as well, in terms of how one does return to body, you know, how does one return to the physicality as an almost like kind of precursor to some sort of political as well as social reflections of motion became very important in the kind of latter stages of the research. And again, you know, just to sort of point out, you know, in the way that Charlene von Hale kind of puts her work into practice is also very much kind of part of the way that she displays and curates it. So at the Liverpool Biennial, in 2000, at the Tate Liverpool a couple of years ago, there was an exhibition that kind of equally was representative of some of her kind of more mediated, kind of drawn images, printed images, as well as sort of paintings that are very performative and kind of very, very physical. Which again, as I said, it would make sense in relationship to my second chapter that almost kind of goes back, no, it doesn't go back, but looks at the idea of a mediated image, a communicated image, an information image, if you like it, whereby the sort of the sense of gesture that perhaps in Van Hale was kind of explicated and was kind of directly kind of applied is almost taken away and eradicated.